I started going into the warehouses in the dead of winter, when the streets of San Francisco were quiet and damp, and most people were either home or tucked into bars that smelled like spilled beer and fried food. My interest wasn't graffiti in general. I wanted the ones that depicted strange figures, creatures half human, half something else, the ones urban explorers whispered about online. They weren't art galleries, they were abandoned spaces left to rot, boarded over, or stripped of anything valuable. Some had broken windows with shards hanging like teeth. Some had ceilings collapsed into piles of wood and dust. The smell was always the same: mold, rust, and damp concrete. I liked it. I liked the emptiness. The first time I noticed someone was behind me, I didn't think much of it. I had headphones in, music low, and I looked over my shoulder and saw a figure across the alleyway. At first, I thought it was a homeless person or another explorer, but he moved differently. He didn't approach. He didn't make any sound. He was just there, in the periphery, staying out of reach, always keeping a distance. At first, I brushed it off. San Francisco has a lot of people wandering, and I was often alone in these areas. It was when I started noticing the footprints that I felt my stomach twist. One evening, after climbing through a rusted gate into a warehouse that had its roof half collapsed, I followed a trail of human footprints along a beam-strewn floor. They were muddy, dark, pressed into the dirt and broken tiles. Then I saw them. Prints that were longer, with wide toes splayed oddly, the kind of shape you'd expect from a foot built to grip rather than walk normally. They ran alongside the human prints, matching pace in a way that suggested someone, or something, was deliberately keeping close, but without stepping exactly on the same line. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything except the faint creak of settling wood above me. I kept photographing. I didn't want to stop. I told myself it was worth the discomfort. The graffiti was sharp and striking, some of it fresh, some of it decades old. One piece in particular, a humanoid figure with exaggerated limbs and long, clawed fingers, had been tagged in a corner where the light barely reached. I crouched to get the angle, and noticed a note scrawled nearby on a wall that had begun to crumble. The handwriting was jagged, almost childlike. "You shouldn't be here. They are watching too." I froze. My camera hung around my neck. I turned slowly, expecting someone to step out of the shadows. There was nothing. Only darkness and the faint outlines of broken crates. My heartbeat was loud enough to echo in my own ears. I scanned the building, trying to convince myself it was a prank, maybe a message left by another explorer or a tagger who didn't like intruders. Then I noticed the prints. They led away from the note, deep into the shadows beyond the broken doorframe, vanishing where the floor had caved in. They weren't fresh, but they were recent enough that I could trace the path, and they made my stomach knot with unease. From that point, I became aware of being followed every time I went out. Even when I doubled back, changed streets, or waited in a corner for several minutes, the sense of eyes on me never left. There were moments when I thought I caught a glimpse of movement across an alley or a reflection in a broken window. Each time, I told myself it was a coincidence, maybe a stray cat, maybe a delivery truck turning a corner. But the footprints always confirmed it. Human and something else, always in pairs, always keeping pace. The winter nights were long and foggy. Fog clung to the edges of warehouses, curling around rusted pipes and fallen beams. It made it harder to see, easier for someone to hide. On one occasion, I was crouched behind a toppled crate to photograph a mural on a high wall, something depicting a figure with two long fingers, staring down from the brick. When I straightened, I realized the alley had become unnaturally silent. The city was never silent. Somewhere, a car should have passed, a train should have rattled. I moved toward the exit, and that's when I saw the figure. Not close, not attacking, but standing just outside the edge of the light from a broken window. He had a hood, face obscured, and then he moved slowly, deliberately, just far enough to keep the distance but never leave my line of sight. I left without finishing the photos. I felt raw panic, like the walls themselves were shrinking. On the way back to my apartment, I retraced my steps, checking alleys and doorways. Every turn I made, I felt the same presence following, keeping pace but just out of reach. Once home, I double-locked my door and left a light on. The apartment felt empty, but safer. I sat with my camera, reviewing shots I had already taken, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I couldn't stop. The next week, I returned. I told myself I was prepared. I carried a flashlight, wore boots with good traction, stayed near the edges of streets. And yet the feeling persisted, the small movements in the corner of my eye, the shadows lingering too long. I started noticing other things. Discarded cans placed deliberately near doors that had been pushed slightly open despite being closed when I arrived, markings that could be coincidence or could be warnings. The final time it happened, I went into a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The sky had been clear, the streets silent. Inside, the building smelled of mold and wet wood, but also something else: metal, rust, and smoke. I followed the graffiti trail deeper than I ever had, down a series of narrow corridors that bent unpredictably. The human footprints were faint now, but the other ones were clear, leading me toward a collapsed wall at the back of the building. My heart raced. I didn't want to look, and yet I had to. I reached the end of the corridor and found the wall partially fallen, exposing the alley beyond. Footprints led right into the street, where the city lights started again. I saw a figure standing across the street, watching. Not moving, not approaching. Just watching. The claw-like prints ended at the threshold of the street, and I realized whoever, or whatever, had been following me had stepped into a space where I could see them clearly, and then stopped. The figure waited, not in a threatening way, not like they wanted to hurt me, but with intent. Watching. Waiting. I didn't hesitate. I backed away, keeping my camera ready, but feeling powerless against the simple act of leaving. I walked into the open street, and turned to glance back once. The figure was gone. There were no prints in the wet asphalt. Nothing. Just the normal city smells, the faint hum of cars and distant voices. After that, I stopped going into abandoned warehouses. I sold the camera I had used for that winter, deleted the files. I walked the streets during the day, took public transit, stayed in well-lit areas. I never saw the figure again. I never found out who it was. I never found out if anyone else had left the notes or followed me. I still think about it sometimes in quiet moments, about the human and the other footprints. About the person who stayed just out of reach, careful, deliberate. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't random. It was someone who wanted me to notice without ever confronting me directly. I realized I had been marked in a way that was personal, but not violent, just enough to remind me that my curiosity had limits. I never returned to the abandoned warehouses, and I never tried to photograph cryptids again. I understood finally that some spaces are private, not in a legal sense, but in a human one. Someone else had claimed that territory, and I had ignored it. The lesson stayed with me. Seeing is not always the same as being allowed to enter. I had agreed to house sit for my cousin in the summer of 2009 while she was out of town. Her house was on the outskirts of Phoenix, tucked between a stretch of desert scrub and a small cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families, a few older couples, and the occasional empty lot that seemed to go untouched for years. The house itself was a modest single story with a low, flat roof, pale stucco walls, and a yard that was more desert than lawn, dotted with cacti and hardy shrubs. I'd been to her place a few times before, but spending nights there alone was different, a heavier, more deliberate kind of quiet that didn't exist when anyone else was around. The neighbor across the street was always there. I noticed him the first day I arrived. He didn't park fully in his driveway, leaving his truck half-angled onto the street. At first, I assumed it was laziness or carelessness. He would be outside when I came home, doing small things, watering plants, sweeping the driveway, adjusting a hose. But he always seemed to glance up toward the house in a way that felt deliberate, as if he was timing his movements to watch. I ignored it at first, convincing myself it was just a man going about his morning routine. But I noticed patterns. Certain times of day, his truck would be parked the same way. Certain days, he lingered by the side of his house just long enough to see me step onto the porch. It started with small things. The trash cans. At first, I didn't think anything of it when the cans were moved, but after a few days, I realized the contents of our garbage were rearranged, odd items placed on top of others, some thrown out when I knew I hadn't disposed of them. I started taking out trash late at night, thinking that would prevent him from rifling through it. But even then, the next morning, I would find the cans nudged into slightly different positions, like they had been handled. I began to notice him in subtle ways, his presence magnified by the silence of the desert nights. The air was dry and still, the kind that carries sound over long distances. Footsteps crunching on gravel. A shadow moving across the yard when the sun had long set. Once, I thought I heard the faint sound of binoculars snapping open, though that could have been imagination. One night, I turned off all the lights in the house before going to bed. The living room curtains were drawn, and the house was silent. I had a single bedside lamp on in my room, soft enough not to illuminate the street outside. I noticed movement through the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then I saw him crouched in the yard, just beyond the glass, holding something. The binoculars. His hands were steady, and his eyes pressed against the lenses as he watched me. My stomach dropped. I froze, realizing he had been waiting, crouched in the darkness, and I had been blind to it. The stillness of the desert made the moment feel stretched, like time had slowed to accommodate the weight of his attention. I called the police immediately. The officer who responded took a report, walked the perimeter of the house with me, and assured me someone would patrol the neighborhood. By the time we finished, he was gone. There were no footprints, no evidence, only the lingering sense that he had been there and could come back at any moment. I lay awake the rest of the night, listening for the slightest sound, my eyes fixed on the dark yard beyond the blinds. The next days were worse. I started to notice details I had missed before. He would occasionally step onto his porch, adjusting a chair, tilting a plant, but always positioned so he could see our windows. I installed temporary locks on the windows and made sure the doors were double-checked, but even with those precautions, I could feel his gaze. I stopped walking outside after dark, instead doing chores in the morning when the light would make me visible and perhaps less interesting to him. I started keeping blinds closed, moving the furniture so I could see all entrances from any room. The house began to feel like a cage, my movements measured and deliberate, a constant negotiation with someone unseen but unmistakably present. I noticed a routine in him over the week. He would come outside in the late afternoon, linger for 20, sometimes 30 minutes, then leave. There were moments when I could swear he was just standing at the edge of his driveway, pretending to adjust his truck or sweep the porch, but always in my line of sight. I began sleeping lightly, waking at small noises, a door creak, the wind rustling through the scrub, a distant car, and immediately scanning the windows. My heart would pound before I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was reading danger where there might be none. But the incident with the binoculars proved otherwise. Food deliveries and errands became complicated. I avoided leaving the house, relying on snacks I had brought and water stocked for the week. I would wait until early morning to leave for a quick trip to the store, moving quickly, never staying long. I would scan the street repeatedly before leaving, looking for the truck parked in that telltale way. Sometimes it was there, sometimes it wasn't. That uncertainty was worse than the certainty of seeing him. Each night, I inspected every window before going to bed, double-checking locks and sliding doors. I placed a chair under the doorknob of the back door, a makeshift precaution, and positioned lamps near windows to illuminate dark corners outside. Every noise outside made me tense, rustling, the distant drone of an air conditioner, the scrape of metal against concrete. I could no longer tell which sounds were natural and which belonged to him. By the fourth night, I was exhausted mentally and physically. The sun in Phoenix was relentless during the day, but it was the nights that wore me down. I started recording my own movements on paper, logging the times I noticed him, when I left the house, what doors and windows were checked. It was methodical, almost obsessive, but I needed some sense of control. I had no proof beyond my own observations, but the pattern was undeniable. Finally, near the end of the week, my cousin returned. I left the house early, unable to sleep, and waited for her outside. When she arrived, I went straight to the police station with her. Together, we filed a detailed report, including the previous complaint and a log of his behaviors. They promised increased patrols and suggested filing a restraining order. We documented everything: the truck's positioning, the times he appeared, the binocular incident, the rearranged trash. After that, I never went back alone. My cousin was there for the remainder of the summer, and we spent most of our time outside or with the doors wide open to give the impression of presence. Eventually, the neighbors stopped lingering, though the feeling of being watched never completely left. The house-sitting assignment was over, but the experience remained vivid. It had been a slow build, almost imperceptible at first, but once realized, the reality of his attention, the intrusion into private space, the vulnerability of being alone, made every day and night feel tense and fragile. Looking back, I understand now that it wasn't just the act of watching or rearranging trash. It was the meticulous consistency, the deliberate attention, the way he inserted himself into routines without overtly confronting or threatening. The fear wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, patient, and deeply personal. That week taught me the subtle ways someone could occupy your space, the invisible weight of being observed, and the vigilance required to reclaim safety when it is silently violated. Even years later, the memory of that house, the desert nights, the binoculars, and the quiet patience of his gaze remain in my mind with an almost tactile clarity. I set out for Montana in early July 2014 with no plan beyond driving, stopping where I wanted, and camping wherever the road looked inviting. I had been living in the city for too long, stuck in routines I hated, and needed a break from people, from noise, from everything that felt like obligation. The air in Montana was a different kind of quiet, one that made your ears ache at first because they weren't used to it. I drove for hours on winding back roads, past dry fields and occasional stands of pine. Occasionally a ranch house appeared, and sometimes nothing at all but a ribbon of asphalt and the sound of my tires rolling over it. I found a riverbank that looked perfect for a night. The river ran clear, wide and slow, bordered by smooth rocks and tall grass. I pulled the truck onto a narrow path, parked, and spent some time scouting the area. It was far enough from the road that no car would bother me, but not hidden so completely that I would feel trapped. I set up my tent near a bend in the river where the current was calm, the water reflecting the pale light of early evening. I unpacked my bag, set up my small camp stove, and ate cold beans and bread. The smell of the river, the wet soil, and pine soothed me more than food ever could. As night fell, the air cooled, and the river's surface darkened. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the water and the occasional call of a night bird. It was peaceful at first, the kind of silence you notice because it has weight. After a while, I started hearing footsteps along the river. Soft at first, hesitant. I assumed it was another camper or maybe a fisherman checking traps. I didn't panic, but I did tense. The footsteps circled at a distance at first, stopping intermittently, then moving closer. I convinced myself it was nothing, a local enjoying the river at night. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the steady murmur of water. The next morning, I found things out of place. Small rocks had been stacked near the front of my tent in a deliberate way, like markers. One rock balanced perfectly on another. I didn't recognize the pattern. A short distance away, a stick had been driven into the ground, pointing toward my tent. It was unsettling, but I told myself someone was just playing around, maybe a hiker who had passed by. I packed the stones and the stick into a small pile, intending to discard them later, and tried not to think about it. That evening, I noticed more items. Small branches arranged in a rough circle, each pointed in my tent's direction. It was subtle, but the arrangement was precise, intentional. I didn't sleep well that night, the sound of footsteps louder now, more confident, closer. The pattern repeated the next morning, and I realized someone had been near my tent while I was sleeping. I felt a sharp tension in my chest, a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. On the third night, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping. I froze, straining to listen. The noise wasn't random. It moved along the riverbank, paused, then resumed. I stayed under the thin nylon of my tent, hoping whoever it was would go away. Morning revealed the most disturbing thing yet. A small stick figure, crudely made of twigs, with my initials arranged at its base. I had never left anything like that, and it hadn't been there the day before. I felt exposed, watched, and finally afraid in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't linger after that. I packed quickly, every rustle of leaves or snap of twig making me glance over my shoulder. I drove away, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, that someone had just been a prankster or a local who enjoyed leaving markers. But I knew deep down that someone had been paying attention to me, following me in some small, deliberate way. A week later, I returned to the same riverbank, this time with a friend who wanted to see Montana's backroads. We drove slowly, scanning the riverbanks for the campsite. It looked untouched, familiar in shape and structure, the rocks and river the same, the path I had taken to set up camp clearly visible. But when we stepped out, I saw the arrangements again. The small stack of rocks, the stick pointing, the twig figure. Nothing had been there before I arrived, but there it was now, precisely as I had found it during my solo trip. I walked carefully around it, studying the placements. The rocks were balanced with care, sticks placed with intent. My initials were still arranged at the base of the twig figure. The realization hit me hard. It hadn't been random or coincidental. Someone had been here before, leaving the same markers, and the first time I had camped here, I had unknowingly become the recipient of these arrangements. I looked at the surrounding area. The river curved gently, rocks smooth and worn. Grass swayed in a faint breeze. The woods beyond were dense and silent. Nothing suggested recent human presence. No footprints, no trash, no fire scars. Yet the markers were unmistakable. It was almost impossible to imagine how long they had been here, how many nights someone had spent carefully placing them. I left the campsite with a tight knot in my stomach. I felt that same tension, that same nervous energy, now compounded with the realization that my experience had not been unique or accidental. The markers weren't a one-time act. They were a pattern, a method, a presence. My friend didn't understand the weight of it. They were curious about the arrangements, noting the craftsmanship of the twig figure, the balance of the rocks, the orientation of the sticks. I didn't explain why it disturbed me so thoroughly. Driving back along the winding roads, I replayed the trip in my mind. I imagined someone watching from the woods, studying me, waiting for the right moment to mark my presence with those small, deliberate items. The idea that I had been observed without knowledge or suspicion gnawed at me. I thought about how quiet the river had been, how close the footsteps had come, how careful the person had been not to make any direct contact. Everything was methodical, controlled. I stopped at a roadside diner to clear my head. The hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the smell of frying bacon and coffee grounded me. I tried to explain the feeling to my friend, but words failed. I didn't want to seem paranoid, irrational, or melodramatic. But the fear, the awareness of being noticed, remained sharp under the surface. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about the campsite. I couldn't shake the image of the twig figure, my initials at its base. I considered returning again, trying to understand if there was any logic to the placements, if it was a ritual, a habit, or something else entirely. But I didn't. Part of me feared what I might find, what I might discover about the person who left them, and what it said about being alone in a place that felt isolated but wasn't invisible. The memory followed me for years. When I drove along rural roads or camped near rivers, I remained aware of the possibility of observation, careful of how I approached any area that seemed secluded. I realized that someone didn't need to make themselves known to exert influence, to mark territory, to create unease. The markers had been enough. I never returned to that exact campsite alone. I never saw anyone there, never encountered anyone who could have been responsible. It was the absence of contact that made it so disorienting. The realization that someone could be that close without revealing themselves, that they could manipulate my perception of safety and privacy without ever showing a face. Over time, I shared the story sparingly. With friends who camped, with people who traveled alone. Most listened with mild amusement or skepticism. Few understood the tension, the careful anxiety that had filled those nights along the river. But I knew it had been real, that it had been deliberate, and that the markers had been more than a prank. They were a statement, one that I would never forget. Eventually, the markers became something I could recount clearly, without panic, but with recognition of their weight. The image of the rocks, the sticks, the twig figure, and the initials remained etched in my mind as symbols of observation and intrusion. It was a lesson in awareness, in the fragility of solitude, and in the presence of others, even where none seem visible. I still think about that riverbank when I plan trips now, choosing campsites with care, scanning areas before settling, aware of shadows, of movements, of what might be left behind without knowledge. The experience taught me to respect the quiet, to recognize the subtle signs of human presence, and to understand that being alone is never quite the same as being unseen. Years later, I returned to Montana, exploring different areas, still drawn to the backroads and rivers. But I never went back to that exact riverbend. I can picture it clearly: the water, the bend, the path, the trees, the precise placement of the rocks and sticks. It is a memory anchored in fear, observation, and the small, unnerving power of someone else's silent attention. The twig figure remains in my mind, a reminder that isolation is fragile, that attention can be exerted without confrontation, and that the markers left behind are sometimes more telling than the person who placed them. Even now, I think about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed, if I had ignored the stacks of rocks or the pointed sticks, if I had stayed another night. The thought leaves a lingering unease, a tension in my chest that I carry on long drives and in quiet campgrounds. I don't know who the person was, what their motives were, or if they still visit that riverbend. I only know the effect it had, and how carefully, deliberately, they marked my presence in a way that could not be erased. The campsite has stayed empty in my memory, a place of precise markers and the realization that observation does not require confrontation. The stones, sticks, and twig figure remain vivid, a reminder of a time when solitude collided with unseen eyes, and when my awareness of being watched reshaped how I moved through quiet, rural spaces forever. I rented the cabin with 3 friends for a weekend in September 2012. The listing made it sound perfect, isolated, quiet, tucked away in the woods of rural New Hampshire. It was exactly the kind of place we thought would let us get away from the noise of our daily lives. The drive there took longer than expected, winding along narrow, twisting roads lined with thick trees. By the time we pulled into the gravel driveway, the sun was low, slanting golden light through the branches. The cabin was small, wooden, and aged, but the porch looked sturdy, the windows clean, and the interior smelled faintly of pine and old varnish. It had a wood stove, a kitchen, and enough beds for all of us. It felt comfortable, remote, like a place where we could disappear for a few days. The first night, we were unpacking when a car came up the driveway. An older man got out and walked up without hesitation. He said he liked to meet new renters so he could recognize their voices later. There was something off about the way he said it, almost casual, like it was normal to just show up at someone else's cabin. We didn't know how to respond. He left after a few minutes, still smiling, and returned to his car. That was the first time I felt that strange tightening in my chest, a sense of being observed. We tried to shake it off, attributing it to nerves or the unfamiliar setting. The cabin was quiet otherwise, and the first evening passed with the usual clatter of settling in. Making beds, unpacking, preparing dinner, the kind of domestic motions that make a place feel lived in, even temporarily. Outside, the woods were dark and still, the wind rustling the leaves. Every now and then, I thought I heard a footstep, a soft crack of a twig, but assumed it was the cabin settling or one of us moving around. By the second night, the sensation of being watched became harder to ignore. Doors that we had locked would creak in the middle of the night. Sometimes it was subtle, a soft shift, a barely audible groan from the hinges. Other times, it sounded like someone pacing just outside, careful but deliberate. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear. My friends were asleep, but I couldn't shake the tension crawling up my spine. I checked the locks repeatedly, walked the perimeter once, and saw nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no shadows, just the dark trees closing in around the cabin. We started keeping a watchful eye on the windows, especially the ones facing the path that led to the older man's property. The woods seemed too dense for anyone to move through quietly, but at the same time, the noises continued, irregular and unpredictable. One morning, while walking near the edge of the property, I noticed something carved into the bark of a tree, crude and deliberate. I see you. The letters were deep, jagged, as though someone had used a knife. My stomach turned cold. It was close, maybe just beyond the treeline. It wasn't a threat written in anger, but a statement meant to be found, to remind whoever saw it that they were being watched. From that moment, I couldn't ignore it. Even during the day, the sense lingered. I noticed details I hadn't before. Footprints in the dirt, slightly flattened grass along the edges of the property. A branch bent just low enough to suggest someone had moved through recently. Each time we stepped outside, I felt eyes on us. The woods were alive with sound, and each sound became a potential presence. My friends tried to laugh it off, but I could see the unease in their eyes. The third night, it escalated. I woke to the sound of something dragging across the porch. It wasn't heavy, but deliberate. I froze, listening. The rustle of leaves followed, soft, methodical. My heart hammered in my chest. I sat still, trying to convince myself it was just a raccoon or a deer, but the rhythm of the movement didn't match any animal I had known. It was too purposeful. I couldn't sleep again. When morning came, I went outside, circling the cabin. There was nothing, no footprints, no signs of passage. It was as if the presence had been there and disappeared without a trace. Over the next day, we tried to distract ourselves, hiking along nearby trails, collecting firewood, keeping busy with the small routines of cabin life. But even in daylight, I felt tension, a low-grade alertness that made my skin itch. I noticed subtle things, a shadow moving between trees, a window curtain swaying though all the windows were closed. The older man did not appear again, but his presence was implied in every observation, every minor anomaly in the forest around us. The final night was the hardest. The air was cooler, the woods quieter, but the tension didn't lift. Every crack of a branch made my heart jump. I lay awake until the early hours, listening to the wind and imagining figures just beyond the treeline. I thought about the carved message, the footsteps, the creaks, and the feeling of being watched that had shadowed every step since the first night. My friends slept, seemingly oblivious. I felt alone even with them in the same room. We left early the next morning. Packing was silent, each of us subdued. As we drove away, I looked back through the windshield. The cabin sat small and quiet among the trees. No sign of anyone else. No car. No figure. Just the woods, endless and still. And yet I knew the memory of those nights would linger. I remembered the tree, the words scratched into the bark, the deliberate sounds in the dark, the unnerving casualness of the first encounter. The older man, whoever he was, never needed to show himself again. The knowledge that he could watch us and leave us guessing was enough. Even now, years later, I can picture the cabin, the dirt path, the trees leaning close. I remember the way silence could feel thick, heavy, almost physical, and how being alone, or thinking you were alone, can make the ordinary frightening. The trip was meant to be a simple getaway. It became something else entirely, a quiet lesson in the discomfort of being observed, the subtle terror of knowing someone can exist on the edges of your world without ever revealing themselves. I never returned, and I never will. The memory is enough. I was 21, halfway through my junior year, and eager for a break from everything that felt ordinary. Spring break of 2017 arrived like a relief, and my friends and I decided to take a road trip into the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee. None of us were particularly experienced campers. Most of our weekends involved cheap motels or staying at someone's family cabin, but this time we wanted isolation, something barely touched. I remember scrolling through maps, looking for roads that narrowed trails that led to little-used clearings. Eventually, we settled on a spot that seemed almost forgotten, a pull-off along a ridge that opened onto a flat area just large enough for a few tents. There were no signs, no marked paths, and the drive itself took hours of weaving along steep, winding mountain roads where the trees pressed in close on either side. The first afternoon, we arrived as the sun was beginning to tilt toward the western slopes. We parked the car on a patch of gravel at the edge of the clearing and unpacked our gear. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The ground was littered with brown needles, soft under our boots, and the faint sound of a creek ran somewhere below us. I remember thinking how unreal it was to be this far from any road, how quickly the forest swallowed the evidence of human life. Setting up the tents took longer than I expected. We laughed at each other's fumbling, the poles that refused to lock, the canvas that refused to stretch right. By the time the sun was low, the tents were up, and we had a small fire going. The first night was uneventful. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the canopy above. The wind moved differently here, slower, whispering against the leaves rather than cutting through them. Stars were faint, almost drowned by the dark green of the mountains. Around 3 a.m, I woke to a sound that was too soft to register immediately, almost a brush against the needles. I thought it was an animal at first, a raccoon maybe, but the sound stopped when I held my breath. I turned, squinting toward the edge of the clearing. My friends were asleep in the other tents. Nothing moved. I convinced myself it was nothing, the kind of tension that comes from being alone in the woods at night, and I drifted back to sleep. The second day, we hiked a short trail nearby. The forest was alive in a way that felt overwhelming. Moss hung from the trees, and small streams ran along moss-covered stones. There was a smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. We were careful not to leave anything behind, gathering sticks for the fire and packing all trash. At night, I noticed small signs along the dirt path leading back to our clearing. Footprints that weren't ours, pressed in soft mud, faint but definite. I pointed them out to my friends, but they laughed, suggesting I was being paranoid, that it was probably a deer or some local hiker. I wanted to believe them, but there was a hollowness in the way the shadows pressed against the tree trunks, a kind of thickness in the dark that made me tense. The second night, it became impossible to ignore. I woke in the middle of the night to the soft crunch of dirt under shoes. At first, I thought my friends were joking. I assumed one of them had come back to the fire or was wandering around, trying to scare me. I got out of the tent quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and looked around. The clearing was empty. My friends' tents were closed, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. I walked closer to the dirt where we had stepped to set up the tents, and I froze. There, pressed into the soft earth, were words. They were clumsy but deliberate. "I see you." Small arrows were etched in the dirt, pointing to each tent. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how alone we were. The sun had long gone, and only the weak light from the fire remained. My heart thumped, and I crouched down, touching the letters. The dirt was freshly disturbed. I returned to my tent, trembling, and tried to convince myself it was a prank. My friends were all asleep, snoring softly, so it couldn't have been them. I lay there for hours, eyes wide, listening. Every branch snapping in the dark sounded like someone moving closer, and every rustle of leaves was a footstep that didn't exist. I didn't sleep. The third day passed with a tense, brittle normalcy. We stayed near the clearing, gathering firewood, hiking a little, trying not to think about the night. At one point, I went a short distance to the edge of the ridge to look out over the mountains. The valley stretched far below, blue and misty. I thought about the footprints in the dirt, the words, the arrows. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to touch the tents without us knowing. I tried to picture them, but all I could see was the vague movement in the trees, the way a shadow seemed to pool near the undergrowth. Night came again. We ate quickly by the fire, the flames small but enough to keep us warm. The wind had picked up, rustling the canopy with a constant low hum. I could feel the shift in the air, the way the dark pressed harder in places, forming shapes that weren't really there. I went to my tent early, lying down with my bag zipped around me, hoping exhaustion would help. I woke suddenly, not to a sound, but to the absence of sound. Everything outside my tent was still. I shifted, and then I saw it, just beyond the mesh, a tall figure standing perfectly still. It was entirely black, featureless, like someone in a full-body suit, but taller than any of us. My stomach dropped, and I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I wanted to bolt, but every muscle refused to cooperate. I lay there, frozen, watching it, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the firelight, a shadow thrown by the wind. But the shape stayed, motionless, unmoving. Eventually, dawn came. The figure was gone when the first light touched the clearing. I unzipped the tent quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The clearing looked normal, except for the dirt, the marks from the previous night, which were even clearer in the pale light. I didn't mention it to anyone, and no one asked. We packed quickly, silently, moving as if urgency alone could erase the memory of what had happened. On the drive home, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure behind us, half expecting to see footprints following our car. The roads were narrow, winding, and I kept imagining someone slipping in behind us on the bends, keeping pace without ever being noticed. The mountains shrank behind us, and the sunlight seemed almost too bright. Back at school, I avoided talking about it. I deleted the photos I had taken, except for a few that showed the ridge from a distance. The memory haunted me more than the images ever could. I couldn't place exactly why it felt so invasive. It wasn't a person trying to rob or attack us. It was someone claiming a presence, a reminder that even in the most isolated places, you aren't truly alone. I never went back to the Appalachian clearing. Every time I thought about camping again, every time I considered a remote hike, the memory of that tall, still figure pressing into the darkness returned. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a local checking on campers, maybe a kid playing a prank, maybe just someone walking through. But none of the explanations fit. The way the arrows were drawn, the way the words were pressed into the dirt, the silence and stillness of the figure over me, it wasn't playful. It was careful. It was deliberate. Eventually, I told a friend who had a similar experience once, someone who had felt followed in the woods without ever seeing anyone clearly. She understood the sensation, the intimate claustrophobic awareness of being observed, the way your own senses sharpen and twist in response. I realized that the fear wasn't about what the figure could do. It was about what it already had done. The person had walked among us without detection, had traced our presence, had left messages meant only for us. The horror wasn't in the attack. It was in the proof that someone else had been there watching, knowing, and leaving evidence of their awareness. Years later, the memory still comes back sometimes, especially when I'm alone in a quiet place. It's not the mountains themselves that are frightening now. It's the certainty that someone could slip into your world without warning. That isolation is never absolute. I never returned, and I never will. I don't know if the person ever came back, if they ever watched others in that clearing, or if it was a single, isolated intrusion. What I know is that the memory is precise. I remember the sound of leaves underfoot, the smell of wet pine, the way the wind bent around the tents, and the black shape, unmoving, looming over me. That's enough to keep me away. I learned that spring break doesn't always bring freedom or fun. Sometimes it brings encounters you cannot explain and will not forget. Sometimes it teaches you that even when you're surrounded by friends, even when the night is quiet and the mountains seem empty, someone else is out there. And the knowledge of that alone is enough to make you never want to return. I'd been planning the trip for months. The idea of being completely alone in the Olympic National Park, a kind of quiet promise to myself. I needed space, time to untangle my head after the breakup that had left everything in my life feeling raw and exposed. I packed light, carried only what I thought essential for a solo hike through the Hoh rainforest area, a part of the park most people didn't bother with. The first day went exactly as I had imagined. The soft, moss-covered trails, the smell of wet wood and leaf mold, the occasional creek cutting through the forest with water clear enough to see small stones shifting in the current. I set up camp near a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to let in patches of sunlight and the sky above. There was nothing in sight except the deep green of the forest and the distant, muffled sounds of birds and water. That first night, the quiet settled around me like a soft blanket. I slept hard, untroubled, waking to the pale light of morning filtering through ferns and dripping moss. The second night was different. I had hiked deeper into the woods during the day, following a narrow trail along a ridge, and I returned to my tent exhausted, but content. I didn't notice anything at first. It was only when I brushed away some fallen leaves from the entrance that I saw them. Footprints in the damp earth, larger than mine, heavy and irregular, circling the tent in a pattern that didn't make sense. I stared at them, trying to convince myself they belonged to some animal, a deer, maybe a bear passing too close to my shelter. But the spacing was wrong. The depth, the impression of weight, it was human. I traced the edges with my boot. The prints formed a rough circle around the tent, coming close enough to brush against the guy lines. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that sometimes the forest itself could play tricks on you. I stayed awake that night longer than usual, listening. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed exaggerated. The wind whispered through the canopy, but sometimes it carried a sound I couldn't place. Footsteps that matched the movement of the tent flaps, soft but deliberate. I convinced myself I was hearing things, that my imagination was running away with me, but I didn't sleep well. When morning came, I walked the perimeter of my camp. The prints had faded in the soft rain that had started overnight, but the feeling lingered. Over the next few days, I tried to stick to the main trail, but the isolation was part of what I wanted. I carried my backpack further into the forest, over fallen logs, past streams where the water ran cold and clear. I set up camp each night in slightly different spots, always secluded, always thinking I was careful. Then I started noticing small things. A branch broken at waist height, near a place I had passed earlier. The same faint impression in mud that looked like someone had knelt down, paused, and then walked away. I found scraps of paper or bark with marks on them that I couldn't interpret at first. Lines drawn roughly, a crude map in the dirt near a ridge where I had rested one afternoon. My stomach sank when I realized that the center of the crude map was marked with a spot that matched exactly where I had camped the night before. The forest felt different after that. I couldn't shake the awareness that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I started keeping my fire small, sleeping lightly, making sure my tent was zipped tight. I avoided leaving any signs of my presence. No extra footprints, no scent I could help leaving. But the feeling persisted, a tightening in my chest every time I moved through the underbrush, every time I paused to drink from a stream. I began to notice more subtle signs. The faint indentation of a branch pushed aside just so, the way a log had been rolled slightly from its resting place. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was deliberate. It wasn't random, it wasn't careless. By the fourth night, I knew for certain I was being watched. I woke just before dawn, sensing movement, the faint crunch of leaves under boots that weren't mine. I held my breath and listened. Someone had been circling my tent. I could feel it, the weight of eyes, though I couldn't see them. I stayed frozen, counting steps, letting the wind cover any noise I might make. When the footsteps finally stopped, I waited another hour, too tense to move. When I finally left the tent, the prints were clear in the damp soil, fresh and unmistakable. They circled me, marking each approach and withdrawal. I packed up quickly that morning, moving faster than I had any right to after days on the trail. I didn't stop at the same places. I avoided resting in clearings, sticking to narrow trails, under dense tree cover, hoping the forest would shield me. I kept my eyes open constantly, scanning shadows, listening to every shift in leaves and branches. Then I found the map. I had stopped near a small stream to refill my bottle and crouched down on the bank to drink. My gaze flicked up to the slope behind me, and there it was, pressed into the dirt, a crude drawing, unmistakably of the area around me, a triangle marking my tent's position. Someone had been here very recently. I felt a cold rush of panic. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew there was a person somewhere above me, watching, marking my movements, tracking me through the forest for days without my knowledge. The realization hit me with a force that left my chest tight and my head spinning. I moved quickly, making my way down the trail toward a ranger station I knew was several miles away. I didn't linger. I didn't look back. Every snap of a twig, every brush of leaves against my pack made me flinch. The sun was low by the time I reached the main road, and I kept walking, hoping someone would come along, someone in a car or on a bike, anyone who could confirm I wasn't imagining this. Eventually, a park ranger's truck appeared. I waved my arms frantically. The ranger stopped, and I explained what I had seen, though I couldn't be sure how coherent I sounded. They radioed for backup and escorted me back to a safe area, noting the footprints and my descriptions of the map and the trail. I never saw the person who had been following me. The authorities suggested it might have been a stalker who knew the area well, possibly another hiker obsessed with solitude or tracking people. They said it was rare, but not impossible. I left the park the next day, shaken and wary, carrying only my pack and memories of the forest that had been both peaceful and terrifying. I never went back. I still think about that map sometimes, the way it had been pressed into the dirt with a single purpose, and the heavy prints circling my tent. It was a reminder that being alone doesn't always mean being safe, and that some obsessions follow quietly, patiently through the shadows. I drove into Joshua Tree in late October 2019 with nothing more than my camera bag, a small backpack, and a tent that I had borrowed from a friend. The desert was quiet in a way I had only seen in photographs, an expanse of beige and muted greens, punctuated by the dark shapes of twisted Joshua trees that bent toward the sky like arthritic fingers. I wanted to capture the landscape in early morning light, the way shadows carved the rocks and sand, the way the sun sharpened the edges of boulders like sculpting tools. I found a campsite near Skull Rock, a formation that seemed to hover unnaturally above the sand, and set up there. It was secluded, far from any main road, and I liked that. I liked the silence. The first night was colder than I expected. I had a fire going, small but enough to heat the metal of my camera and the air around me. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind scraping over the rocks and the faint rustle of something moving far off in the distance. At some point I noticed footprints near my tent. I froze. They were fresh, pressed into the sand in a single, careful line. My first thought was that it must be another camper or a photographer passing through. I had expected a few people in the area. But then I realized the footprints formed a loose circle around my tent. I couldn't see where they had come from or where they went. They appeared to stop as abruptly as they had started. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was nothing. The desert is vast. Maybe someone had come and gone hours ago. I checked my camera, set up my tripod, and tried to focus on the shots I had planned for the next morning. But the silence pressed in on me differently after I noticed the footprints. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every time the wind shifted, every small sound seemed amplified. I heard something like my name whispered, soft and quick, almost carried by the wind. It wasn't real, I told myself. It was the desert playing tricks. Still, I could feel my pulse in my ears. Over the next day, I moved around the rocks, photographing light falling over boulders, the way shadows cut the ground into patches of contrast. Every so often, I would notice something odd. A shadow shifting along the edge of my vision, a glint of movement behind a boulder that disappeared when I turned. I started keeping my camera close, lens cap on, ready to lift it at a moment's notice. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore a narrow trail that led into a cluster of jagged rocks. I wanted to photograph the sun sinking into the crevices, the way the light pooled and scattered. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire low, but I still heard crunching sounds around my tent. The footprints had multiplied, leading toward me from different directions. I stayed inside the tent, unzipping just enough to peer out. The desert was dark, but there was movement. A figure, a person, crouched just beyond the reach of the firelight, hidden among the rocks. It didn't move naturally. Every time I looked directly at it, it seemed to vanish behind the rocks, only to reappear when my gaze shifted elsewhere. I thought I had imagined it at first, but then it happened repeatedly. It was deliberate, the timing perfect. I packed up at dawn. The desert was still, the sand cool under my fingers. I didn't take any photos that morning. I only wanted to leave. I moved slowly, carrying my gear and checking over my shoulder constantly. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the distance, but there was nothing I could identify clearly. The rocks themselves seemed to shift in the early light, forming shapes that suggested something living, but were empty when I approached. I drove to the edge of the park and stopped at a small cafe near the entrance. I spoke to the hikers and campers there. One man told me that people had rumored someone lived among the rocks, watching anyone who came too close. They called it a squatter or an old hermit, someone who had been there for decades. The stories were vague, but the implication was clear. People had been aware of him, and some had taken care to avoid him entirely. I thought about the night I spent circling my tent. I thought about the whispers and the way the figure had moved. There had been nothing supernatural, nothing impossible, just someone intentionally hidden, observing, tracking my actions. The more I thought about it, the more my skin crawled. I realized that the footprints, the whispers, the perfectly timed movement, everything had been calculated. I had been part of someone else's careful observation, and I had not known it. After that, I avoided Skull Rock for the remainder of the trip. I went to areas that were clearly visible from the road, where I could see hikers and vehicles at a distance. Even then, I felt uneasy. Every rock formation seemed to carry the potential for someone to hide. Every shadow seemed a possible presence. I focused on my photography, forcing myself to frame shots carefully, using the desert light as a distraction, letting my lens act as a shield between me and the world beyond it. By the time I returned home, I had taken hundreds of photos. Most of them were ordinary: sunlit rocks, spindly Joshua trees, desert flowers curling in the wind. A few captured a sense of the scale and emptiness that had first drawn me there. None of them captured the figure. None of them explained the whispers. But the memory remained, persistent and clear. I had never felt as small and exposed as I did that night, and the idea of someone observing me, invisible and calculating, stayed with me long after I returned to my apartment. Months later, I spoke to another photographer who spent a lot of time in Joshua Tree. He confirmed that the area near Skull Rock was notorious for people living in the rocks, unregistered and unseen. Hikers and campers were sometimes watched for days at a time before being approached or simply left alone. There were stories of theft, of confrontations, of people fleeing in the middle of the night after noticing footprints that didn't belong to them. It wasn't the desert itself that was dangerous. It was the human presence that could go entirely unnoticed until it was too late. I realized then that my experience was not unique. I had been lucky. The person or people who had circled my tent never stepped closer, never attempted to enter my space or communicate beyond the whispers. The timing of their movements was careful, almost respectful in a way that made it harder to feel safe, but easier to survive. That night could have ended differently, with confrontation or worse, but it didn't. I returned to photography, but I never camped alone in the desert again. I avoided remote areas, sticking to trails and campgrounds with multiple people. I learned to check for signs. Footprints in the sand, the way rocks appeared disturbed, the smallest traces of human presence that could indicate observation. I kept my camera ready, my flashlight pointed toward any suspicious shadow, and my senses sharp. The memory of Skull Rock never faded, and I sometimes replayed the way the figure had moved in my mind, imagining their perspective as they watched me. It was uncomfortable, terrifying, and instructive. Eventually, I went back to the desert with other photographers, sharing experiences, tips, and warnings. I told them about the whispers, the footprints, the figure that moved perfectly with my gaze. Some dismissed it as imagination, some nodded knowingly. A few had seen the same things themselves. None of us spoke about the identity of the watcher. It was enough to know someone had been there, watching, calculating, and unseen. I never went back to Skull Rock, but I still visit Joshua Tree occasionally. I photograph the desert from roadsides, from campgrounds with other people nearby. The landscape is still beautiful, still quiet, still worth capturing. But the memory of being alone with a watcher is a constant reminder. I carry that night with me in a way that changes the way I approach solitude, the way I approach nature, and the way I trust spaces that seem empty. There is beauty in the desert, but there is also caution, and I learned that the hard way. Even now, years later, when I see a remote desert campsite or a photograph of Skull Rock, I feel the same tension that night created. The awareness that someone could be watching, calculating, hiding, waiting. I carry it with me, a lesson in vigilance, in respect for the unseen, and in the fragility of solitude. The desert is still there, beautiful and harsh, but I am never truly alone in it. Not since that October night when I realized that someone else had been moving perfectly in time with me, unseen, and that my presence had been their entire focus. I keep the photographs from that trip stored carefully, mostly unedited, as a reminder. They capture the desert, but they also capture the awareness, the unease, the small, sharp edges of observation that remain in my memory. I cannot say who watched me or why, but I know the desert is not empty. I know the desert has eyes, and that some of those eyes belong to someone who has learned to move like a shadow, to circle tents, to whisper names, and to remain perfectly, deliberately unseen. I survived and I left, and that is the full measure of what mattered. I returned to the city carrying the weight of the desert, the echoes of footsteps in the sand, and the certainty that even in wide open spaces, someone could be closer than I imagined, just beyond the edge of vision and watching. That night at Skull Rock remains a benchmark in my life. It shaped the way I travel, the way I approach solitude, the way I understand fear. It was a lesson in being observed without knowledge, in the vulnerability of isolation, and in the way human presence can invade a space without ever revealing itself. I left the desert with photographs, yes, but more importantly, with a permanent awareness that even the quietest, emptiest places may not be as empty as they appear. I started noticing him one late summer evening. I had been working at the small bookstore in the center of town for a few months. The days were long, and the shop's windows faced the street, letting in the light of the fading sun. That evening, as I was stacking new shipments of paperbacks on the back shelf, I saw him across the street, standing just beyond the curb near the cafe. He didn't move much, but he didn't leave either. I thought I recognized him at first, but the features were vague. He didn't look threatening, just present. When I glanced back after arranging the next stack, he was closer. He seemed to have shifted down the block, still watching, still quiet. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe he had been walking past or waiting for someone else. The next day, as I walked home after closing, I felt it again. At first, it was subtle, footsteps a few blocks behind me, in rhythm with my own. I stopped at the corner store, pretending to read a poster in the window, and waited. The footsteps paused a moment after I did, then continued once I moved again. My pulse rose, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The streets were nearly empty that hour. There weren't many people walking. Still, I noticed him, dressed in a dark jacket, hood pulled low, keeping a distance but never disappearing from sight. I began taking different routes home, circling blocks, doubling back. Each time, I caught a glimpse of him, sometimes half a block ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes across the street. Always watching. He never approached, never spoke, never made a move that could have drawn attention, but the certainty in his presence made me feel exposed. My apartment wasn't far from the store, just a 15-minute walk, but I felt myself rushing, checking every reflection in the shop windows, every darkened doorway. I tried to track him one afternoon, walking a circuitous route through alleys and side streets, but he wasn't there. I returned home and left the door locked twice before even thinking about unpacking my bag. The nights became restless. I would wake up with a start, convinced I heard a footstep on the stairs outside my door. I checked the locks, the peephole, even the small window by the entrance. Everything was empty, silent. I told myself I imagined it, that the fear was a product of my own vigilance, but the gnawing certainty never left. At work, he began to appear more often. Not always the same time, never long, just a presence I felt more than saw. He lingered near the corner where the newspapers were stacked or outside the window for a few minutes before turning down the next street. I noticed details, the way he tilted his head slightly, the glint of light off the frames of his glasses, the scuffed laces on his shoes. I started jotting these details down, almost compulsively, because the act of recording made the fear manageable. At home, I reviewed them like evidence in a case I wasn't sure anyone else could see. I thought about reporting it, but I worried they would laugh, say it was nothing, say I was overreacting. There was no clear crime yet, no physical threat, just the slow, persistent watching. I didn't sleep well. My hands shook when I brewed coffee in the morning, when I reached for my keys, when I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment. The fear was subtle, creeping into every part of my day, a shadow that never left. Weeks passed. The pattern became more precise. He showed up in the same places, at roughly the same times, yet never in a way that could be pinned down. I began noticing small things at home. Footprints in the dust on the windowsill, the faint scrape of a shoe on the pavement outside my apartment at odd hours. Nothing could be proved, nothing could be reported. I considered moving, but realized the thought of leaving my routines, my carefully structured life, made me feel more exposed. The familiarity of the streets, the predictable rhythm of the bookstore, gave me a fragile sense of control. Leaving it would only hand him the advantage. One night, returning from work, I caught him in the act of crossing the street in front of me, almost casually, but the eyes locked on mine. I froze, my steps faltering, heart hammering. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just kept walking slowly, deliberately. The way he moved seemed choreographed, like he was measuring distance, observing reactions. I felt a weight in my stomach, a cold certainty that I was being hunted, though there was no weapon, no rush, no threat beyond the relentless attention. I realized then that the fear itself was the weapon. I began carrying my phone in my hand, recording audio or video when I thought he was near. It felt absurd at first, holding the device like a shield, but eventually, I couldn't bear to leave it in my bag. I installed security cameras outside the apartment, leaving a light on near the entryway, double-checked all the locks, and even placed a chair under the door handle at night. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. Except the unease, which grew sharper, more defined. Every sound on the street, every car that slowed near my building, every shadow cast by a streetlight could be him. My life shrank into patterns I could control, moments I could monitor, but it never ended. One afternoon, I left the bookstore for a short errand. The street was empty, the sunlight bright, but I felt it immediately, the presence behind me. I quickened my pace, glanced down a side street, and there he was, walking casually, hands in pockets, as though nothing had happened. He seemed closer now, or maybe I had just become hyper-aware of the space around me. I ducked into a small cafe and sat in a corner where I could see the doors and the street beyond. I stayed for hours, nursing a cup of tea, watching, waiting. When I finally left, he was gone, but the shadow lingered in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. I began carrying pepper spray, checking doors repeatedly, leaving lights on at all hours. I noticed the strain on my face in mirrors, in shop windows, in the glass doors of the grocery store. My friends asked why I avoided social events, why I didn't answer late-night texts, why I seemed anxious in public. I lied. I didn't know how to explain the constant observation, the dread that followed me home, the sense of being monitored even in my own apartment. I had no proof, no one to corroborate my fear. I was alone with it, and it filled every corner of my life. One night, I came home to find the small metal chair I kept under my door handle knocked over. My apartment smelled faintly of tobacco, even though I didn't smoke, and my neighbors rarely did. My pulse jumped, my fingers tightened around the pepper spray in my bag. I searched the apartment top to bottom, checking windows, closets, even under the bed. Nothing. Nothing but the lingering sense that I had been here, recently, almost casually. I slept with the lights on, the door locked, my bag against my body. I began to notice subtle changes on the street outside. Trash bins moved slightly, a newspaper in the wrong position, the faintest footprints in the dirt along the curb. The observations were meticulous, patient, methodical. I felt as though he was cataloging me as much as I was trying to catalog him. I realized then that the fear wasn't just about safety, it was about control. I was being watched in every movement, every routine, and I couldn't escape it, couldn't confront it, couldn't prove it. Months passed. The sightings became less frequent, or maybe I became better at avoiding him. I changed routines, varied routes to work, stayed longer at the bookstore until the streets cleared. I installed stronger locks, an additional camera near the entrance, and even spoke to the building manager about someone loitering outside. They dismissed it as a minor concern, a vague description, nothing concrete. I couldn't convince them otherwise. The turning point came one morning when I woke to a note slipped under my apartment door. No words, just a photograph of me leaving the bookstore the previous evening, taken from the street. My hands shook, heart racing. The image was clear, unmistakable, and undeniable. I called the police, showing them the photograph and the pattern I had meticulously recorded over months. The sightings, the recordings, the footprints, the minor disturbances. This time, they took it seriously. They increased patrols, suggested I get an alarm system, and offered advice on restraining orders. I stayed in the apartment, but changed the way I moved entirely. I never walked the same route twice in a row. I varied hours. I avoided being seen through windows. My friends noticed, my coworkers noticed, but I explained it as caution, as habit, as concern over petty crime. I never revealed the photograph. I never told them how precise, how personal, how calculated the attention had been. Weeks later, I caught him one final time. Across the street, standing beyond the curb near the cafe where I had first noticed him. He watched briefly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of a busy afternoon. I felt a weight lift, but not entirely. I knew that in a city of millions, there were always eyes. I knew the fear had reshaped me, had taught me caution, observation, vigilance. The police never found him. The photograph was the only tangible proof, and even that didn't lead to a resolution. Life returned to a fragile normal. I could walk the streets with less urgency, sleep with fewer lights on, leave the apartment without triple-checking locks. The fear lingered, a faint ache in the chest, a reminder of the months I had been observed, catalogued, and measured. I understood then that the danger had never been about confrontation, about violence. It had been about presence, attention, the way someone could insert themselves into the smallest corners of a life without being caught, without leaving obvious traces. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment, further from the center of town. I didn't change my routines completely, just enough to feel safer, to feel a measure of control. I watched for shadows, for movements, for shapes in windows, but never again did I see him. The feeling of being monitored gradually receded, leaving only memory, a careful respect for the fragility of everyday security. I knew the world held people who observed, waited, and disappeared without reason or explanation. I had lived through it. I had survived it. And though I never saw him again, the experience reshaped the way I moved through the city, the way I considered the spaces I inhabited, and the way I trusted the ordinary rhythms of life. The fear had a name, a shape, and a lesson, and I carried it with me quietly, constantly, carefully. 2 years later, I revisited the street where it had begun. The cafe was still there. The bookstore had changed hands. I looked for him, half expecting, half hoping. He wasn't there, of course, but I felt the memory of him in the corners of the block, in the shadows of the windows, in the reflections of the glass. I walked past calmly, my steps steady, my heart slower. The city felt different, not safe, but manageable. I understood now that sometimes the people who haunt us leave no trace, and the only way to survive is to learn how to live in the presence of their absence. I never learned his name. I never knew why he chose me, why he lingered. I have no final confrontation to mark the end, no moment of clarity to close the chapter. The story ended simply with time, distance, and vigilance. And in that ending, I found my resolution, not in capturing him, not in understanding him, but in reclaiming the quiet spaces of my life and moving forward with careful awareness.